It is March 27th, 2025. And as we are now just over 2 months into Donald Trump's second term in office, we're getting a feel for the way in which he's going to handle U.S. foreign policy. It's not quite the peace filled world that we were promised, given the fact that he's openly bombing Yemen and promising to continue to do so for a long time. But there are still a lot of question marks surrounding Ukraine. Are we going to see a partial ceasefire? Is Kiev going to actually allow it to be implemented? Are we going to see a potential deal between the US and Russia? And is that something that Russia would allow and that the US would follow through on? So many questions here, and we got into all of it and more with a special guest earlier. So let's take a listen to that conversation now. Joining me now to discuss is Scott Horton, director of the Libertarian Institute, editorial director of antiwar.com, and host of Anti-War Radio and the Scott Horton Show, and the author of the largest book I think I have ever purchased, which is Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and Catastrophe in Ukraine. Scott, thank you so much for taking the time to join me.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Now, I just got the book this week, so I haven't gotten into it too much. So I'll reference it a bit, but I would encourage people to go check it out. And I'll, of course, leave the link in the description box below. I want to start out a little bit broad here. When it comes to the Trump administration, we're now 2 months into Trump's second term. And when you look at what he campaigned on, I mean, it was ending the war in Ukraine in 24 hours. It was peace in the Middle East, at least there towards the end. And when you look at what he's actually done, not only is the war in Ukraine still ongoing, but now you have Trump openly supporting a genocide that is being carried out by Israel against the Palestinians. Oh, and he's also bombing Yemen. And he's now claiming that the US strikes in Yemen have been very successful and will continue for a long time. Now, again, I know we're only 2 months in here, but will you take us through kind of how you view the Trump administration's handling of U.S. foreign policy so far?
Yeah, well, look, I mean, Zionism has always been the massive flaw in his theory. Um, I don't know if this makes sense to people, but I think of, Ron Paul as Thomas Jefferson. So then Donald Trump is Andrew Jackson, right? It's not the same thing. It's, there's a lot positive about right-wing populism. And it sure as hell beats center left or center right conservatism and center left neoliberalism, which I am also thoroughly sick and tired of. So it's understandable why people are moving further to the left and further to the right due to the failures of the centrists over the last generations here. And Trump, certainly channels a lot of that populist energy that they know that they've been sold out and forsaken by the people who are in charge of the country. And, he may be wealthy, but he's a real estate tycoon, right? No one thinks that he's one of the masters of the universe here, right? He's not them. And he's wealthy enough that he could be independent of them. We talk about the $600 million that the Adelson family has given the Republican Party, and especially him, over the last 8 years or 10. He didn't need that money at all. He was already a billionaire. I don't know if he has $10 billion like he says, but he's got billions for sure. And he could finance the entire Republican Party, national, state, and local, his own campaign, all the senators and congressmen and all the governors and state reps too. Why not? That's chump change, literally. He could make more back in investments over the time than he spent on the thing, right? If he would have just done that, then the only conflict of interest is they all owe him, which would have been fine with him. And so, his children, his grandchildren are set for life. He has no need to do this. But instead, he took the establishment's money, and particularly the Israel lobby. And, there are a lot of different factions of power and wealthy people in America, but the Israeli lobby is highly organized and highly effective, and it just doesn't make political sense to cross them. And so what's the opposite of that? Do what they say, and everything will be fine. And so that's how politicians run, most of the time. It would take a real special exception for him to really stand up to them. Going back, I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has been prime minister off and on since 1996. And he was out for a little while there in late Clinton and early Bush. But essentially this whole time, all these presidents have had a very hard time dealing with him, right? You never had a situation where Clinton or Bush or Obama or certainly not Trump or Biden ever said to him, now you listen to me, this is what we're doing. It's not like that. They never can do that. And quite clearly, they just can't. And Trump is just all in because he doesn't really know or care at all. And so if you look at his first term, he even told the anecdote. Yeah, I asked him, so tell me, what's the deal with this whole Golan Heights thing? And they talked to me about it for 5 minutes. And I said, fine, you can have it. And at that point, that was how he decided to recognize Israel's seizure of the Golan Heights, and which no other country recognizes their control over, but America now does because he says so. And then moving the embassy to Jerusalem was really important. Bill Clinton and W. Bush, and I think Obama had all promised to do so and never did so. And the reason it's so significant is because the Israelis claim that all of Jerusalem is the undivided, eternal capital of Israel. Well, that means the Palestinians can't have the eastern half of it, which is where they live and was supposed to be the capital of an independent Palestinian state. So by moving the embassy there, it's highly symbolic, meaning America recognizes the Likud plans for the region rather than the previous understanding of the Oslo Accords and the two-state solution, that's being abandoned for this more Netanyahu-based policy. And then, of course, the Abraham Accords, where all the Sunni kings had promised they would never normalize relations with Israel. They call them peace deals. There's no war going on, but they said they would never normalize relations with Israel until they gave a fair shake to the Palestinians. And then, but Jared Kushner decided that, well, what's your price? And so he gave Bahrain F-16s and UAE F-35s and Sudan debt relief and recognized Morocco's seizure of the northern half of the nation of Western Sahara and said, for these price, now you guys all normalize your relations with Israel. And they called that the Abraham Accords, and a big success for Israel. And in fact, Netanyahu explained in his big speech in September of 2023, just 2 weeks before the October 7th attack, at the end of September, he gave a speech at the UN General Assembly where he held up a map. He always likes to have a visual aid, Netanyahu, either a cartoon bomb or something. Here he holds up a map of Israel, and all the West Bank and Gaza are the same color as the rest of Israel now. It's all greater Israel now. And the message of the speech is, ha ha, I won, you lose. And he's actually mocking, it was an inside joke for Israelis and others like attuned to this, I read later, that he was mocking Shimon Peres, who had been Yitzhak Rabin's successor back in 1996, and who, well, sorry for the tangents. I got too many tangents, but Rabin and Perez had said, we have to deal with the Palestinians so that we can deal with the Arab states. And that'll be the new Middle East. And Netanyahu said, this is the new Middle East. We'll deal with the Arab states and the Palestinians get nothing. And he said in the speech, essentially, no one's coming for you. See, he's like mocking them. All these people who are holding out for you, they're not holding out for you no more. No one's coming. You'll never have citizenship and you'll never have independence. Just get used to being essentially prisoners, in your open air concentration camps. And that's the best you're ever going to have. And that was the point of his speech at the UN General Assembly at the end of September 23. And then it was 2 weeks later that Hamas broke out of their pen in order to exercise their veto over his plan or attempt essentially to radicalize the region again around the conflict, because they're facing total defeat at that point. What does that make Trump? It makes him not a Russian agent. It makes him essentially, in practice, a cat's paw of the Israelis. And Sheldon Adelson and his wife, Miriam Adelson, who's an actual Israeli who clearly just married this old gambling magnate for his wealth so that she could use it for exactly these purposes. They have paid into the Republican Party $600 million. That's according to the great journalist Eli Clifton, who's one of the co-founders of the Quincy Institute, an excellent journalist going back for decades now. I've known him. and he's done an incredible story on that kid who got banned from NYU and deported and all of that stuff. He's Clifton is the one who showed it. Is literally Miriam Adelson is behind the group that's going down and hunting down all of these foreign nationals in America who've dared to cross Israel to get them deported. She's literally the one organizing all that, and people can read all about that at Responsible Statecraft, is the Quincy Institute's foreign policy journal website there. So that all just sucks, and it's why I couldn't vote for Donald Trump. And I'm so disgusted with the left for all the same reasons as everybody else, and then some, and old grudges I still have against Bill Clinton and all kinds of problems. I just hate them so much. I can barely contain it, but I still couldn't bring myself to vote for Donald Trump because this is just the absolute major flaw in his theory. You can't be America first and Israel instead. It's one or the other, and clearly, unless something major changes, something really comes to a head, some kind of real, probably personal and public fight with Benjamin Netanyahu between their two egos or something like that, we're basically stuck like this. And God help the poor Palestinians. I mean, look at what's happening to them. Trump's giving it the greenest of lights. He don't give a damn what they do to those people. And so I just don't know what else to say. I don't, and this goes straight to the war in Yemen. You know, I'm sure you live on the internet. You see people going, well, the Yemenis, they're messing with us. Ah, come on, man. Like, really? Is that,
Right.
you know, I know that you know that we've been at war over there this whole time. Okay. So let's just start with maybe something happened before they're messing with us, you know? And what's really happening, of course, is they're bombing Israel in defense of the Palestinians. And they're, I guess, bound by the genocide convention to intervene if there's a genocide, which I don't agree with or believe that we should be a part of that, anything like that, because of course genocide's an excuse for governments to intervene where they should not. And in fact, you look at what the Houthis are doing here, as sympathetic as I am for the Palestinians as well, the Houthis are risking spreading this war to be a much worse war, including getting their own countrymen killed, and as well as knowing the war hawks and the way that they spin these conflicts in the United States, that this could lead to war with Iran if the Americans get all caught up in their slogans and talking points that the Houthis are just a front for the Iranians and everything they do is Tehran's responsibility. That could quickly lead to worse conflict there, and all for Israel. Because Israel's bombing the Palestinians. As long as they're bombing the Palestinians, the Houthis have a problem with the Israelis. Otherwise, this whole thing would be over. You know, America helped Saudi Arabia and UAE bomb Yemen for, 8 years, essentially, from 2015 through 22. But not because they'd done anything to us at all. In the words of the Obama administration officials to the New York Times, this was to placate the Saudis and the UAE because they didn't like that a Shiite government had taken over in Sana'a, in the capital of Yemen there, which was, of course, blowback from previous American foreign policies that had caused that to happen at the time. But they hadn't done anything to us. They say death to America and death to the Jews in their stupid slogan, which is very bad public relations, but they had no beef with us. And in fact, at the beginning of 2015, the United States was helping the Houthis kill Al-Qaeda guys, because to the Al-Qaeda guys, the only good Shiite is a dead Shiite. So the Houthis said, hey, give us targeting intelligence and we'll light these guys up. And Central Command was happy to help. And it was in the Wall Street Journal. Anyone can read it. Just look up Houthis, Central Command, Wall Street Journal, January 2015. And then the great journalist, or not great, but she's okay, journalist Barbara Slavin also wrote a piece about this for Al Monitor, where it was Michael Vickers, who was the Deputy Secretary of Defense for Intelligence, came to the Atlantic Council and briefed them all about it. Yeah, get this, guys. We're giving intelligence to the Houthis because they kill AQAP. And it was just 2 months after that Barack Obama stabbed them in the back and took Al-Qaeda and Saudi Arabia's side against them. So, in other words, the Houthis mean us no harm, and we have no need to get into a tangle with them. This is all Israel instead foreign policy, instead of America first foreign policy. Is the only reason this is going on. And I mentioned it was for people doing the arithmetic there. Oh, I did say it ended in 22. because the Houthis were reaching out. Our last war with them did, because the Houthis were reaching out and blowing up Saudi refineries with their drones and missiles. They were getting better and better at retaliating against economic targets inside Saudi Arabia. And so the Saudis quit. In fact, there was a great article or two about how the ruling elite got so pissed off at the Saudi prince and made him end the war. So it was over. And through no real effort of Joe Biden, but it ended in the early Biden administration. There's no reason in the world to start this thing back up again, other than America supporting the Israelis. And isn't it funny, as Caitlin Johnstone pointed out, all over Twitter, people said, we had to do this. We had to respond. We had no time to go to Congress and get a declaration of war because it was such an emergency. And then the text messages leak out and didn't seem like an emergency there. They were talking about, geez, I don't know. Do we have to do this? Maybe we should spend a month buttering up the American people about why this is necessary before we start and all of this. So where's the emergency that they didn't have the time to go to the Congress and get an authorization for war? Who does Donald Trump think he is? Barack Obama? He could just start a war. And so it's very bad news all the way around. But then also, you did ask me about Ukraine. And so I will say, I do believe that Trump was sincere, that he wanted to end the Ukraine war, that he wants to end the Ukraine war. Obviously, he was bluffing that he could end it in a day. There is no easy solution to the thing, and I think he's finding that out the hard way. But this is absolutely the best thing about the guy, is he hates this war. I think he truly believes it would have never happened if he was there. I don't know. He says that same slogan about Israel, but it's less meaningful there. In this case, this is, Biden, certainly in his eyes, and probably quite literally, Biden stole the presidency away from him and then blew up everything and ruined everything. And this, first and foremost, among them all, in a situation that he absolutely would have prevented, he thinks. And the fact that he was certainly out from under Russiagate meant that he had much more freedom of action, certainly in his second term, if he had won in 2020, to figure out a final peace deal, to end the civil war in the East, and come to a final agreement with Russia about the status of Ukraine in regards to NATO and the rest. He absolutely could have done that in his second term. And it's just inconceivable that the Russians would have marched to war the same way that they did in 2021 if Donald Trump had been the president at that time. It just would have been an entirely different situation.
Oh, I was just going to say, yeah, it's so interesting to think about, as you're pointing out there, how Trump's first term went. And I was kind of thinking about that when you were mentioning, Trump and his dealing with Israel during his first term. It was so easy for him to just be like, you want the Golan Heights? You want to move our embassy? Oh, sure, whatever. The Abraham Accords are great. Well, now he's dealing with the blowback from the decisions that were made during his first term. And that context that you pointed out there, that's another thing, that when it comes to Ukraine, the media here in this country, right? They do not want to talk about context whatsoever. They want to talk about their narrative of the moment. Well, then this week, we also got this U.S. intelligence community report, their 2025 annual threat assessment. And in it, they specifically say Russia retains momentum as a grinding war of attrition plays to Russia's military advantages, and that this grinding war of attrition will lead to a gradual but steady erosion of Kiev's position on the battlefield, regardless of any U.S. or allied attempts to impose new and greater cost on Moscow. So they're basically telling the Trump administration, hey, you want to put more sanctions on, you want to send more military aid, go for it. It's not going to change the situation on the battlefield. So what do you make of the fact that the intelligence community is admitting that now, but also what that means for the Trump administration and how they're going to proceed?
Exactly. Perfect question. That's exactly it. So first of all, yes, exactly. That's how my book ends, with this is the state of the war. And all of the critics of this war, all of them have gotten this right the whole time, that time is on the Russian side. The Ukrainians are putting up a hell of a fight, and the country itself is the size of Texas. It's not, indefensible territory. It's a tough slog for both sides. It's an enormous cost to the Russians, but they're winning, and they've been winning, and they're going to keep winning. And the Ukrainians do not have the ability to turn the tide of the war the other way. They just can't. And so this goes then to one, yeah, it's great. They're finally telling the truth. Now we can have a real conversation about this. But then here's the real conversation about this. Donald Trump's kind of screwed. What's he going to do? Ukraine, i.e. America, in this situation, the Western side is in a position of weakness. We have essentially no cards to play. You just said it exactly perfectly right. You could add more sanctions. You could put more weapons in there, and it's not going to make the difference. So we have no sticks, only carrots to offer. Hey, Putin, if you do what we say, maybe we could normalize relations and lift sanctions and get along better. That's all we got. And we have very little to threaten with. And Donald Trump has very little to threaten with other than he can make promises of goodwill. That it's, and I think this is absolutely right. It's, got to be the most important thing. And I sure hope that this is the Russians' calculation, that America and Russia are more important to each other than Ukraine is to either of them. And we got to be able to figure this out. We'll have permanent neutrality, and we'll put it in their constitution, and we'll sign a treaty if we have to, saying we're never bringing Ukraine into NATO. And whatever, recognizing the new borders pretty much where they are instead of worse. I don't know. That would be a compromise you could ask for the Russians. You don't have to take the entire, literal line on the map borders of Zaporozhye and Kherson. How about you take as much of Zaporozhye and Kherson as you have right now, as much as Donetsk as you have right now. The Russians control virtually all of Luhansk, I believe, except maybe some very small pieces here and there. And they control virtually all of Donetsk as well, I believe. But I don't know, 2/3 or so, 3/4 or something of Zaporozhye and Kherson. Obviously, they control all of Crimea, and that's not changing. That's been the same status quo since 2014 there. So how about that? How about never mind where the old borders of these provinces were? How about where the lines are now? We just freeze frame there. You got as much as you need of the country, something. Find a way to try to save some face for the Western side, for the Ukrainian side in the thing. But otherwise, what are we up against? That eventually Kiev will fall. I don't know how eventually means. That could mean 2 years from now or 3. I don't know. But eventually I really don't know actually the Ukrainians order battle, the strength of their reserves, how many tens of thousands of men they have here, there, or the other place. I really couldn't tell you that stuff. I don't know what it'll take before the Ukrainian military so-called breaks and just falls apart and gets run over. That's been predicted for a long time by some people, and it hasn't happened yet. And they do have the entire West kind of bankrolling them and helping organize their military forces and all of that as well. And they've put up a hell of a fight, already this whole time. As you say, it's a war of attrition, but it's been a very tough one, for the Russian side as well. So, and you have in Kiev a regime that really doesn't want to deal. And that's kind of for personal reasons. I think that Zelensky, politically, if he negotiates, that might represent even the majority will of the country. But there are radicals on the far right in Ukraine who might very well not accept any good faith negotiations here. When he was first inaugurated president in 2019, the first thing they did was threaten to murder him. It was Andriy Beletsky, who's right now, the Azov Battalion became the Azov Brigade. Now it's the 3rd Army Corps of the Ukrainian military, and it's led by the same guy, White Rex, Andriy Beletsky, the same guy who says we got to lead the world lead the white race against the Untermenschen and all of that, the Semitic-led Untermenschen, that famous quote. That's the guy. He's making himself a big hero right now in the war, leading this 3rd Infantry Corps. Now they're calling it. It's been promoted from a brigade to a corps. He said explicitly, I'll hang the president myself from a tree on the main drag in Kiev. I forget how to pronounce the name of the street. Starts with a K. I'll hang him myself. I'll shoot him in the head myself. And Dmitry Yarosh is another Nazi who's threatened to kill the president before. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this. It just came out, but we all know the story of how Joe Biden and Boris Johnson worked together to help scotch the peace deal in April and May of 2022 during the kind of start of the war. Well, so Boris Johnson was interviewed about that recently on a podcast, and he said, well, you know what it was? It's, yeah, not my fault. You know who it was? It was the nationalists. They refused to accept peace. And by that, he means the neo-Nazis. He means, when he says nationalists, he means all the way until the thermometer pops nationalists, right? Those guys, all the way to the right nationalists, like Hitler-loving Nazis. So that was the problem, was they were going to wring Zelensky's neck if he went along with any peace deal. And as they have said explicitly before, and this is before the worst part of the war where hundreds of thousands have been killed. This was when only thousands had been killed. They said, if you make peace with Russia now, then you're sacrificing everyone who's already died in the war for nothing. And that makes you, guilty of the greatest treason. Their sacrifices aren't in vain until we quit. And so if you make their sacrifices in vain, that's on you. And so we can't let you ever end the fighting. We heard the same kind of crap from the Republicans when W. Bush was getting our guys blown up in Iraq War II. Was, geez, our guys will have died in vain if we leave now. Yeah, they died in vain already. Leave now so that fewer do. And they don't want to listen to that. It's the same kind of dynamic here. Maybe very difficult for Zelensky to make any major change. And for example, if you compare him to the government of Afghanistan, he's not as weak as them. When America left, the Taliban just walked right in. It wasn't even the fall of Saigon. It was just the pushing right over of Kabul, right? And so the Russians aren't facing such an easy fight in Ukraine. Even if America pulled out 100%, they're not just going to walk right into Kiev. And Kiev knows that. And they know that they don't have to necessarily agree to any peace deal that Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin cut. If they feel like it's at their expense, they can still try to play that card and resist. And I hope they know better than that. And I hope they don't push their luck too badly. But the situation, as I was just saying with that sunk cost fallacy, the overall status of the different parties and their different interests can look very different to the other side over there. As much as America and maybe the Russians want to quit the war too, doesn't mean Kiev does. And hell, Zelensky just said the other day, oh no, any deal where Russia retains control of this land is null and void. We can't accept that. Well, he doesn't have a magic spell to reverse the Russians' gains on the ground, so we don't know what he's going to do. But according to him, he refuses to quit.
Yeah, that's the part when I look at Zelensky's rhetoric and I go, have you looked at a map lately, right? Are you actually paying attention? Because he seems to live in this fantasy land of, oh, we're going to force Crimea back under our control one of these days. And he's still saying that 3 years in. Now, looking at this from Russia's perspective, as you were noting there, Trump is coming to the table. Initially, he's saying he wants a 30-day ceasefire. He could push for saying, like you were saying, hey, we're going to agree, right, that we'll stop fighting for this territory. We can put the borders here. We'll agree to Kiev's neutrality, on and on and on. But then you look at the position that Kiev is in, where they're not ready to stop fighting. Then you look over here at Europe, where you have Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron talking about wanting to put thousands of troops in Ukraine as quote unquote peacekeepers as soon as there is a peace deal. If I'm Vladimir Putin and I'm looking at this, I'm a little bit concerned that we're still not out of the Minsk deal territory, right? That we're still looking at a possible quote unquote frozen conflict in the eyes of the West, even after everything that they've been through. How do you think that Russia is dealing with this right now? I know we've kind of seen some talks back and forth, and they've said, yeah, sure, we'll give you, a temporary ceasefire here, or we'll bring back the Black Sea grain deal, knowing all along that Kiev is not going to go for any of this. So it's kind of that playing back and forth. But how do you think that Russia actually sees these talks and the seriousness of reaching a deal?
I really don't know. I mean, one part of their thinking has to be concerned with Putin's relationship with Trump, which is highly dependent on the Russian not making the American look like a jerk here for trying to do the right thing. You know what I mean? Trump has a huge interest in pulling this off. Putin has, I hope he understands, a huge interest in helping Trump pull this off, bringing this thing to an end. Because if Trump fails, then that's not just his failure, but that's the failure of the mending of America's relationship with Russia. And now what's Trump going to do? He's going to pour in more weapons. He's going to do whatever it is going to be very bad politics for America and Russia's relationship going forward. So that should be the most important thing, or at least, side by side with their actual interests on the ground in Ukraine. Now, the Russians have a real problem with this. War is a government program and virtually always fails and causes the need for more intervention and more intervention in the eyes of the government program implementers here. So and this is something I said this as soon as the war started. I said this in my speech in March 4th of 22 in Utah. I said, from Russia's point of view, and this is before it was clear, or it was obvious exactly how the war was going to go, but it seemed more like the Russians are just going to march across the country as far as they wish to. And I says, by the logic of government programs, they're really getting themselves into a mess here, because the first thing that they're doing by invading is they're essentially taking the entire Russian population of Ukraine out of the country by drawing the new border around them. They're removing them from Ukraine. Well, the Russian-leaning side, if you want to define it that way broadly, used to win elections. That's why America had to keep overthrowing the government over there, because they would win, right? Now, that's never going to happen again. Now, the Russians have removed all of these, the Russian state has removed all these Russian people out of the country and left a country of Ukrainians behind, and many of whom are still Russian speaking, but that's not exactly the same thing as being the ethnic Russians from the far east of the country. But the communists kind of forced everybody to speak Russian instead of Ukrainian over the years, over the 20th century. And so you have to go pretty far west in the country or out in the countryside to find people who really speak Ukrainian. There's a lot of Russian speakers in Odessa and elsewhere in the West as well. But their politics are sure to be dominated by the radical right. Now, as I was just saying, this guy, Andriy Beletsky, I wouldn't be surprised if he's the president soon. I mean, if he doesn't die in the field here, he is going to be regarded as a major war hero. He's the Stepan Bandera of this generation for these guys. He and his people. And so their political capital is going to be raised up, very high. And in fact, if you look at the map, what about all the land? Let's say the obvious deal, right, is the two far eastern provinces and the two southeastern ones, right? Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, right? Well, what about Dnipropetrovsk or whatever the hell you say? I can never say it. The big province between Donetsk and the river, right?
Dnipropetrovsk, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I know actual Ukrainians who don't know how to say it either. And so, well, what about all them? Now, it's not the most heavily populated part of the country, but those are all Russian speakers. And now that they are in the severe and maybe even like are somewhat ethnic Russians there, and the people, and I don't know exactly all the public opinion and who all is who in Kharkiv, but it's another not far eastern city, but eastern city and province there. How is the new regime going to treat those people when they're, based out of Lviv and Galicia and Volhynia in the far west of the country and are absolutely, vociferous Russian haters? It only makes sense from the Russian point of view that, geez, I guess we're going to have to protect them too and keep the war going. Now you keep the war going. Let's say you get everybody who could possibly even be construed as needing Russian protection from the new, more radical right-wing regime in Kiev. And you got them. Now you have a purely radical right-wing regime in Kiev that wants nothing but trouble and doesn't have any respect for the Russians or will to deal with them in the medium term at all, right? It only makes sense. The war is going to restart, or, if it ever comes to an end at all. If it doesn't, it's just going to keep on rolling through Kiev. You can't have a government run by Andriy Beletsky. And so it only makes sense to march to Lviv. And then now what? Now you're sharing a border with Poland and NATO again. It's exactly what you're trying to not do in the first place. So, I would have recommended that Putin not do this, right? Like, they really have kind of screwed themselves by doing this. It was, evilly ingenious for Lenin to draw the border where he drew it, so that the Russians in Moscow, the Muscovites, would have this kind of dominance over Ukraine expressed through this population. Stalin enhanced it in his time, moving more and more Russians there to dominate Donetsk in order to, if not dominate, at least divide the power in Ukraine. And they had essentially a 51-49 type of balance favoring the East. So all that's over now. And believe me, I'm saying America should have, worked with their friends and allies to implement the Minsk deal and prevent this whole thing from ever happening. But that's over now. That's 3 years gone now. So yeah, the whole thing really sucks, Rachel. I don't really know what to say. I don't see a very obvious and easy piece here. I could see a timeout, but it makes sense, like literally speaking, not from like my personal point of view, but it makes sense that the Westerners see it like it's going to be a Korea type situation where we have a ceasefire and no real peace and probably an uneasy peace, a so-called frozen conflict that possibly has to be resumed and settled differently someday, which is a horse show, which I don't want to think about. I hope that they can figure out. I guess what I would really want to see more than anything, if I have my way, is America just butt out. Just forget it. Come home. Let them figure it out. Let Germany and Poland and Hungary and Britain and France, let them all convene a big meeting and sit down with the Ukrainians and the Russians and see if we can come to an understanding here, and see if they can come to an understanding here. And because they're the ones who got to live with each other. That's the irony of this whole thing. Oh, we got to take Ukraine away from Russia. Yeah, but Ukraine is stuck to Russia, man. Right? That's just a figure of speech. You actually can't move Ukraine from where it is. And so all you're doing is getting them in a fight that they can't win.
Yeah, it'll certainly be interesting to see what the Trump administration, how they handle it, right? Because right now you're kind of seeing them, they're like, sure, we're happy to have talks back and forth, but I'm curious to see how long Trump's patience lasts if there is a point where he says, you know what, we're done with this, we're getting out. And then if he's allowed to do that on top of that, certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Scott Horton, y'all be sure to go and check out Provoked, How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. Thank you so much for your time and insight.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
If anything in this video resonated with you, be sure to like it, share it with your friends, leave a comment, and as always, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to keep up with all of my work, make sure that you're subscribed to my page on Substack. That's rachelblevins.substack.com. That's where you'll find ad-free videos and new weekly episodes of my exclusive series for paid subscribers called Sanctioned. You can also check out Sanctioned over on my page on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Rachel Blevins. As always, thank y'all so much for all of your support, and I'll see you next time.